Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the Cosmic Matrix podcast with your hosts Bernhard and Laura Matsu. Today's episode will be about the wounded healer's journey of opening the heart. And to start off with, we want to give a little definition of the wounded healer, what that entails, what that path is, which also relates to the archetype of Chiron, which we see in mythology a lot.
Yeah, so it's kind of hard to actually describe Chiron without going into a huge story about like everything that he went through in Greek mythology. So if people are interested, I would suggest you just do research yourself. But we've kind of made like, I guess what you could call, I think they call them like Cole's notes, of Chiron and how it relates to, and basically the essential symbolism behind the myth, and then how that relates to the individual in their astrology chart. So the archetype of the wounded healer originated with the Greek myth of Chiron, who is physically wounded, and by way of overcoming the path of his own wounds, Chiron became the compassionate teacher of healing. The wounded healer is a person who has gone through suffering, sometimes great suffering, and as a result of the process has become a source of great wisdom, healing power, and inspiration for others. In fact, the archetypal wounded healer undergoes a transformation as a result of their wound, their suffering, and pain. They can actually transcend it and successfully lead themselves to a path of service to others. It is as if the wound itself helps you drive yourself to an inner journey that becomes transformation itself. One strips away the selfish, ego-based feeling of being all alone in our wound and expands to see others and how, if one chooses a different role, one can help others. And then just personally in our astrology chart, like this path is going to be different for everyone, I think is the main thing. And it really depends on your wounds and the traumas that you go through. So Chiron in our astrology charts points to where we have healing powers as a result of our own deep spiritual wounds. We may overcompensate in these areas of life, and Chiron, as a wounded healer, must first face issues of low self-worth and feelings of inadequacy and learn to rise above these issues. So it's interesting, like you see in people's astrology charts, initially, this is something that they're, especially early on in their life, they may have an insecurity around, they may be completely unaware of, but once they tap into their own wound in this area, it actually becomes a gateway for immense healing potential. Because the wound goes deep and we may work hard to overcome the wound, healing powers are potent. So it's like, I heard this quote, not necessarily always true, but someone once told me, don't try and guide people through something that you haven't been through yourself. And I don't think that's always true. However, for people who have gone through a journey themselves and you're going through it and they've reached the other kind of light at the end of the tunnel, they can be really profound healers and mentors in that area because they've gone through that experience, and they can really tap into like this deep compassion and understanding for what you've gone through. So, like if I have wounds around like, sexual trauma, I'm not going to go see a therapist who specializes in like men's trauma or something, not to say that men haven't gone through sexual trauma, but, we're going to resonate, and especially in my own life, with healers who have actually gone through a similar experience as we have and come out the other end. So yeah, that's a basic symbolism behind Chiron. So maybe let's just get into our own personal experiences and what brought us to the healing arts, because I feel within telling our own stories, we're basically going to demonstrate this wounded healer energy and how it's manifested in our own lives. So maybe you'd like to start and what brought you to body work and even HK and holographic kinetics. Sorry, I'm using the abbreviation. And all the multiple healing gifts that you have as well.
Yeah, basically it relates to my own a lot of childhood wounding and trauma I've went through in my life, and just dealing, especially in my teens and in my 20s in particular, with severe depression, despair of not being able to fit into the world, and not understanding life, and literally dealing with severe despair, depression, suicidal tendencies. which then open up, the question to me, like, who am I? I need to heal myself. I need to understand what's going on. Otherwise, I will kill myself. I will not make it. And that call out to the universe, the call to adventure, so to speak, is also the wounded healer's journey actually also relates to the hero's journey in mythology. And then there's the guidance, the universe or the divine brings in mentors and other healers, supporting forces and introducing you to certain teachings or modalities that help you to heal yourself. And in my case, early on, it was especially certain body-mind practices when I was introduced to yoga and qigong, and especially body work and massage. When I met my mentor literally out in the desert, in one of the desert parties, and received my first massage out there, where I really experienced the body-mind connection, how trauma or wounds or my childhood memories are stored in my muscles and tissue, and through the body work it all came up in a more conscious way, and had a lot of realizations what a lot of the stuff was dealing with related to my childhood trauma and whatnot. And in particular for me, body work helped a lot because I've been also growing up very head-centric, disconnected from my body. And, via receiving body work and diving deep, it was a tremendous healing process for me to dive deep into my body somatically and release a lot of wounds and trauma, and had, again, like I said, a lot of insights, even visual flashbacks to my childhood. And also growing up in Germany in high school, where I was bullied and all of that, and all was still stuck in my body. But via learning, receiving a lot of body work, and then my mentor back then also started to teach me to give certain body work techniques, to give body work, to do massage and work on other people. And in that process, I discovered this gift that I also had, this quote unquote healing touch, and I had a gift for body work, which I wasn't even fully aware of. But, via receiving the work, I was also in how it had an effect on me and how it helped me and healed me in many ways. I was also able to give that to others in a more conscious way, because my body already knew what the experience was and what came out of it. So that, in that arena was definitely, the more I healed myself through body work and learned the craft myself, the better I was able to help others. And then I pursued it more professionally when going to various massage schools and started to become a professional body worker. But the more I receive that work as well, the more I healed myself, the better I became as a body worker. It's almost, like you just said, the more we heal our own wounds and work on our own stuff, the better we are equipped to help others in that particular arena. But it also ties into the saying, what you mentioned before with Chiron in our chart, the major lesson we need to learn. We also whatever we need to learn, we teach the best, or whatever we teach is something we need to learn. There's this saying, or we become the best teachers relating to what we need to learn ourselves. So we always teach and students alike. Mm-hmm. And it relates to what you mentioned, that we have also out of our own experience, we can help others better than just going to academia and learning book smart knowledge, on or healing modalities or psychology. But if we have gone through the process ourselves, we really assist from a place of experience, and that also creates what you mentioned before, true empathy. We can truly relate to another person's suffering because we have been through this ourselves.
Yeah.
Right. And then later in my life, that goes also deeper into psychology, shadow work, and even relationships. A lot of I'm sure the readers of my work are aware of that I wrote a lot about the love bite, the alien love bite, dark side of Cupid, very intense relationship experiences that have an overtone of hyperdimensional interference and paranormal interference, and it transcends even normal relationship psychology. And these kind of experiences I wrote about, especially two of them, were extremely severe and nearly took me out, and there was a lot of suffering. But what I realized when you look back, a lot of the suffering with the trauma we went through in our own ways, if we are able to heal from it or are in the process and engage in the work, is actually an initiation, right? Deeper initiation through the experience. We can help others then who are going through this. Similar with regards to what you have experienced.
Yeah, it's beautiful. So, and my story, I guess, you look at it also with Chiron in the ninth house for you. It's like you're here to like embody the higher self and also bring these higher level spiritual teachings to other people. So I think that through your own like suffering, that's what it's brought you to. And I know like my Chiron was in the 12th house. So that's the house of like spirituality. It's also the house of like insane asylums and prisons. But if you look at it in my own life, like, from the Hindu caste system perspective, like I was supposedly blessed because I grew up in a spiritual family. Like my parents both practiced, this form of like, it's not just asana yoga, but it was called Siddha yoga. And so they meditated, they worked with like mantra, they like had a guru, they saw everything in the universe as a reflection of themselves. Like these basic teachings that like are not common, especially in the small Canadian town where I grew up in. Like I don't think there was that many people who practiced that form of yoga. But I grew up in a like very chaotic family home. So, and they also both disconnected from their spiritual path because of the divorce that happened between my parents. Is there was almost like this kind of like resentment because they both entered this path together. So it was a complicated relationship with spirituality that was like almost like put into me at a young age because of my parents' complicated relationship with their own spirituality. But I could see even growing up, like I was like a very like spiritual child in the sense that I was like intensely tuned into like imagination and creativity. Like had a abundance of creativity. I was also naturally, even as a child, like I wanted to be of service to others. Like I was always like volunteering at like with old folks' homes, with disabled people. Like I would just knock on random strangers' doors and give them flowers just because that felt like that to me. It was just natural and like effortless for me. And then when I reached adolescence, like that's when like really like I started to get traumatized just through society as well. And then also facing my own relationship wounds through unhealthy relationship dynamics, which I was attracted to because of my chaotic family upbringing. And then, if I look back too, like there was an age around like 17, 18 where I was like really getting into spirituality, like pretty basic stuff like Alan Watts and like different teachers like that. And then something happened, major trauma happened basically. I don't really want to go into details on this podcast, but that completely derailed me from that. It's like I totally actually forgot about spirituality essentially. And then like, I don't know, like maybe even close to like a decade of trauma later, that's when I had my first quote unquote spiritual experience again, where things were so bad in my life that I just decided to pray. Something happened in the external world, which gave me a signal that my prayers were answered. I also prayed at this moment, keep in mind, when I didn't believe in like God, that there was anything good in the world, but I was just desperate. Like I felt like I had nowhere else to turn except for God. So that just basically realigned me, in a sense. And that from that point forward, I started healing my own traumas through meditation, yoga. I got into various like kind of self-work. Now I'm working more with like somatic meditation and whatnot. And I mean, this is a long story to get into, but I basically started reclaiming my essence. And there was a point when my basic essence was lost through this kind of accumulated trauma that rose to surface. And then, especially when I moved out into nature, that's when that really started coming back in full force. So, and even now, like I'm starting to realize, like, now that I'm becoming more of my true self, that there's like I do have like a gift with being able to connect spiritually. Like I have like very psychic, intuitive gifts. Doesn't mean I can like read into the future, but like I have abundance of spiritual experiences, which are probably not super common. Like there's something in me that's open to that. And if you look at Chiron in the 12th house, that's really what it's meant to, it's meant to basically honoring these spiritual gifts, but it's come through this large experience of disconnection and suffering that I had to basically reclaim them. So I even remember in when things were really bad, when I was in like a detox center in Vancouver's downtown east side. And if anyone listening is aware, it's a dark, dark place. It's basically like the trenches of human suffering, like drug addiction and all sorts of sex trafficking, etc. But even at that moment, when I was also disconnected from like my spirituality completely, there was like a higher voice and wisdom that told me in that moment, like, you have to experience this so you can see what humanity is dealing with. And I feel that very deeply now, that like, you know, there's nothing that can truly surprise me in any sort of session that I have with some person, because I've been through some extremely dark stuff myself, and I haven't been through everything, but I've been through enough that I know that there is a very dark force that operates on this planet that is keeping humanity trapped in not only just the regular suffering of their life and death cycle and losing people they love, but unnecessary suffering that they're inflicting upon others. So I feel the suffering has actually gotten much worse than maybe times the Buddha was in. Although I take that back. I also heard that there was a very dark time. And it's interesting, you know, I feel it's very much in these darkest times that we're going to have these, we're going to have this arising of these wounded healers, you know, like these are the times when it's most necessary for it to happen. And, so that's just kind of a little bit of my own story, not to go on a bit of a rant, but yeah.
So no, it's beautiful. Thank you. It's interesting because you just mentioned, I was just talking from a like more personal level, but you just reminded me also, and you actually introduced me back into astrology, which we talked about astrology in the previous podcast, really the benefits of it, but maybe also limitations. But it's very interesting, the Chiron placement in one's chart, especially the house placement you were referring to, and like what you just mentioned in my 9th house. I can totally relate, because what does the 9th house characterize?
It's Sagittarius, so it's like higher knowledge, higher awareness, like spiritual teachings, religion, like all of those
so
things.
It's interesting with me, my Chiron in my natal chart in the 9th house relates to like the wound there. And like you said, you know, a lot of it was also driven. I was also in very dark phases, feeling basically completely disconnected from anything spiritual, right? Yeah. And also growing up in a household quite the opposite to yours in a sense. My dad is an atheist.
That's that's a perfect example.
Like nothing
actually.
Religious.
Yeah.
And my mom was like, or still is, maybe was like a social Christian, Protestant. We went to church once a year for Christmas.
Which is the mechanical.
Exactly,
form.
because that's what everybody else did.
Yeah.
But there was, I mean, on the positive side, I was not subjected to any religious programming, but also the zero spiritual, you know, education, so to speak, or nothing related to it, just very materialistic. And then I feel through my own suffering growing up, obviously, as a very sensitive boy, and then becoming quote-unquote an adult, not knowing how to deal with life and all these experiences, that suffering then asked me, like, what is the meaning of life? And then drove me to these deeper teachings, right?
You can see that, yeah.
And esotericism, and relates to what I write about, because I feel one of my quote-unquote gifts out of that, and what I've been told by others, that I'm just really much connecting the dots and bring a bigger picture of how it all kind of interrelates, and bringing in together like spiritual teachings in light of the matrix and in light of my own process, because everything I write about is also based on where I'm at and my own internal experiences from my own wounds. But there's this inner drive to really like connect to the divine, right? To the psychic being, my true self, and what you mentioned before, essence.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is also, you know, the thing on a more collective level, that we don't typically live in this emotionally and spiritually supportive world, especially like what we know as spirituality these days. I think we're moving out of it. Well, I know we're moving out of it, but we also kind of live in a bubble of spirituality. So I don't think our perspective is a grand scope of things. but religion has basically oppressed spirituality collectively. And so this is what we think is spirituality. I'm not saying that there's not spiritual experience to be found in these places. I'm just saying generally it's distorted it. And so we don't live in this emotionally supportive world. And so what happens is people's hearts tend to basically like close down. They get connected from their emotional self, which when their emotional self also has a big connection to their spiritual self, although they're not the same. So maybe you can talk about, that process and like how, through opening your heart, you had to experience suffering.
And vice versa, like through suffering, I started to opening my heart.
Yeah.
Right? That was really, there's this famous Rumi quote, break open your heart and, what was it?
The heart is where, the crack is where the light gets in or something. I'm
break your heart until it opens. I'm called.
Oh, okay. And then Leonard Cohen, I don't know if he got this from Rumi, also has a lyric be like, the crack is where the light gets in. Right, similar. Right. Yeah.
So it is actually ironically through the suffering that we open our heart. And I remember we actually had an earlier podcast about that and generally talking about the role of suffering in the awakening process.
Yeah.
That it has its purpose, but there's a difference, like you just mentioned, between this quote unquote conscious suffering of embracing your wounds and feeling yourself through that as opposed to mechanical suffering or unnecessary suffering.
Yeah, that just reminds me something I just read in this A.H. Alma's book, he uses a lot of Gurdjieff, sorry, I'm saying that right.
That's right.
Work. He talks about ignoble and noble suffering. So ignoble suffering is basically when you don't get what you want in the world, when things don't go as planned, and that's because you're depending on the external world to make you happy. And the noble suffering is when you're basically waking up to your own delusions, to the things that aren't part of your true self that need to be let go of and fall away. So if I have an idea of who I am and how my life is supposed to be, and my life from spirit is supposed to take another direction, there's going to be a certain amount of noble suffering that's going to go along with it. There's also noble suffering waking up to the world. Like I know for myself, like especially when I started getting my meditation and yoga practice, it was very hard to be in the city and see how disconnected people were from themselves and each other and see the state of the world with a clearer vision. That's this noble suffering, I feel.
Yeah. I can relate to the ignoble suffering as well in my own life, looking back. And it ties into saying, tell God your plans and will laugh at you, right? When you're too attached to certain goals, to your image, to your idealized self-image. Mm-hmm. And even back then, many of us, myself included, sometimes have goals and intentions in life or aims in life that are coming actually from the wounded conditioned self and not from essence, right? And then there's the divine, like, no, this is not what you're here to do or what you're here to work or bring to the world. And no matter how much you intend and try to manifest, it's just going to bring more pain. That kind of unnecessary suffering, right? Instead of going deeper and like, it takes also this noble suffering relates to taking full self-responsibility.
Yeah, that's extremely important.
Because the ignoble suffering is externalize it all. It blames others, circumstances, everything external for the way you feel or what's going on with you, right?
Exactly. And I think getting out of this like victim blame trap is so essential because from your higher self's perspective, everything that you're going through has a purpose, and it's about finding the higher lesson in it. And yeah, there's a whole bunch of avoidable suffering once you start awakening up to your true self and getting out of that ignoble suffering. But yeah, as long as you're blaming the external and that keeps you disempowered, and through being disempowered, you're actually disconnected from your true essence and your true self.
And also disconnected, bringing it back to the journey of the wounded healer, from your own gifts.
Exactly.
What you had to bring to the world in terms ultimately in service to others. Yeah. Because similar, like we all have our own soul blueprint, similar to what you mentioned before, I can see them in my own life. I was always driven to help others, to be of service, right? And so I was somehow came in distorted, then also tied into like the savior martyr program distortion, right? White knight syndrome, or just lack of boundaries, people pleasing, and all of that. But there's an inner drive to really make to help others. Right?
Yeah.
And then what I've also noticed in my work, I know you can relate to that as well, the more I truly help others out of pure selflessness, the more I heal myself, right? The more I'm actually healed. I see this a lot of my own sessions when I work on somebody, help somebody, I'm helping myself at the same time for the simple reason because we are one. That's the true meaning of service to others. Service to others is very misconstrued in this day and age and has been distorted from its original meaning. Service to others doesn't mean that you just do constantly think for others. The ego can hijack that as well. Oh, I'm make myself feel better because I'm such a good person, help others, right? Or just give the beggar $10. Oh, I'm such a great person. But service to others means that you truly recognize yourself in another person. Yeah. And by helping another person, you're actually helping yourself. You're helping everyone and the collective.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so let's talk about more like of this idea of like trauma and how that happens to people. And I've noticed a thing with trauma, it can go either way. So this can either create very sensitive people. Like I have this like my own, I'll just go with a little side note. Okay, I'm just going to complete my sentence before I do that. Okay, so either trauma creates very sensitive people, or at the extreme, it will create sociopaths, psychopaths. And sociopaths and psychopaths are basically disconnected from their essence. And then these overly sensitive people, they're almost too tuned into other people and they're not individualized. So then you have these like empaths who are like, I can't be around certain people or whatever. You know, that's because they actually, you know, they are connected to other people, but it's at the cost of them being individualized in themselves. And a good example is just growing up. I see, you know, through my own like, you know, this is also quite common through my parents' own emotional unavailability. It did make me more caring and more tuned in to how other people were feeling because I really, you know, my soul wanted to just make them feel better, you know, and then so that, and then later on in life, if I'm doing that at the cost of my own well-being, then that's actually just, it's not the best place to be in. Like I need to be able to be strong in my own essence in order to help others, not doing it at the cost of myself. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And that could go either way. Like you see, you know, like, or you hear a lot of stories about this trauma that happened to this like person who committed this heinous crime, like murder, whatever. You know, it doesn't have to be that obvious, but, you know, I've noticed even just knowing sociopaths myself, there is a pretty distinct trauma that happened early on in childhood. And so that disconnected their soul from their body. And then in an occult perspective, that's when these darker forces can basically take over, who are pathological, who want to control, who want to have power over other people because it actually cannot be powerful unto itself.
Yeah, exactly. Very important. I just want to also clarify, when you write a lot of people who are actually pathological, even narcissists, sociopaths, are deeply wounded, can be deeply wounded people who have completely dealing with severe soul fragmentation, something installs there and results on a psychological level and severe personality disorders and whatnot. Having said that, there's also the topic of genetic psychopaths, and that's, you know, a topic on its own. I think we touch upon it at some point. I've written about a whole article about it called Psychopaths in Power, the Elephant in the Living Room. But these kind of psychopaths, type of quote-unquote human, is not based on any childhood wounding or trauma, that they're born that way without a conscience, right? That's a very misunderstood topic. But going back to the point you said, there's definitely in this world nowadays, in this matrix, like a trauma installment program. Mm-hmm. And I feel that happens to a lot of very sensitive people, especially targeted in childhood, right? Very, very traumatized, very sensitive people, children. They have psychic abilities, that have certain gifts and talents that actually they are on this path towards service to help during this time of transition, right? It ties a bit into the esoteric topic of the wanderer, what people call starseeds, people that are here, or the bodhisattva with a certain mission profile, but these occult forces, darker forces, azuric forces, hyperdimensional forces, existing out of time and space, they actually sense already the soul projector of every person, right? What's going to and interfere with the life path of somebody without that person already being aware of what they're actually here to do, mm-hmm. in order to derail us. You know, I remember even you told me already you had all these gifts and insights as a young child, and the way you were also in terms of service, and then, like you just said, you got so derailed and through your own trauma that you even completely lost your spiritual connection, or were at some point not even interested in that.
Yeah.
Right, until it came back around. So
I forgot.
You forgot. Yeah. And again, not to fall into victim blame, but there's something, this trauma, that certain people are more targeted than others. And it also, like, you know, it's very complex, because we've written an article about this as well recently. The karma comes in, past lives, you know, they tag into our own blind spots and tempt us in a way where, you know, we just go along with it. We just don't know better because of our own ignorance, basically, and create trap of agreements, right? Even throughout past lives with other forces. But on that note, there's another trend we just experienced, or we just came across, very disturbing, I find, with regards to the trauma installment program. And somebody on the forum was posting about it on the forum, our membership forum on veilofreality.com, about this movement. I hadn't actually never heard about it. The manosphere movement.
Manosphere. Oh, yeah. So it's like the men's right. It's similar to the men's rights movement, where they were saying that basically you shouldn't date traumatized women because you should look for women who have no trauma,
And also stay away from women with trauma, or stay away from women who have daddy issues, and only look for partners for women who have no trauma.
Yeah.
You know? And that is such a red flag. First of all, there's no such thing as one single person without trauma.
Yeah, because we live in a traumatic setup.
Just growing up, and trauma is wounding to varying degrees.
Yeah.
But it's also such an ignorant, you know, statement of just, again, the fallacy of externalizing.
Yeah.
You know, even for relationship, not understanding even relationship, it always takes two to tango.
Yeah.
So people then blame that they have got in relation with a sociopath or narcissist, but there's something within them that responded to that. There's a reason why you attracted that person in your life, or why you were attracted to that person. Most often on an unconscious level. Mm-hmm. So there needs to be a self-responsibility. It's not externally looking, oh, this person has trauma, this has no trauma. And any person who, apparently the guy who posted about this, many coaches talk about this, or relationship coaches, you know, in this manosphere, which also ties weirdly into the pickup artists scene or something like that, you know, which actually seems to be filled with very wounded men to begin with. And they're being told, don't, connect or hook up with women who have trauma or daddy issues.
Yeah,
right?
But
that's just a lack of understanding of not only basic trauma psychology, just basic psychology in general, let alone zero understanding of deeper spiritual knowledge, and also actually lack of understanding of basic relationship psychology to begin with. But it's weird. That's almost like people in that sense, people with trauma are being judged as inferior, right? As something to, you know, not to stay away from, right?
Yeah. Well, I feel it's just a clear case of shadow projection, because at one point I was fascinated with the pickup. I think I even, like, in my darker days, I shoplifted the game once, which was just so I could read it. And I thought it was fascinating. By the side note, please don't ever do that. I'm just saying that, like, I've read the game and I didn't buy it myself, is the point I'm trying to make. Yeah. And this, I mean, these men, they have this obsession with getting quote unquote high value women. And so what determines a high value is, like, you know, like looks, intellect, etc., probably like education. They have all these certain external qualities, and a lot of them, you know, they kind of banded together because they weren't able to get these women, so they had to basically create these psychological manipulation techniques in order to get the woman that they wanted. And one key one, which I've made fun of a lot in my past, is called nagging, which is where you intentionally basically put the woman down so that it establishes a position of superiority over her. And it's interesting because even naturally in, like, unhealthy high school dynamics, like, that's what guys would do, like, kind of pick on the girl that they liked in order to establish that dynamic. But that's coming from a place of wounding, because I mean, sure, many of you know, if you have to put someone down in order to feel good about yourself and establish yourself as a position of superiority, that's not a true sense of power. That's coming from a place of deficiency. So, So yeah, anyway, moving on to like the trauma, I think that basically what's happening on a spiritual perspective is that if they were to actually date someone with trauma, get the emotional connection with someone with trauma, and they were really doing the work necessary in that relationship in order to connect them on a deeper, intimate level, they would have to face their own trauma. So it's about avoiding trauma in relationships, because if you date someone who has trauma in a relationship, it'll also activate your own like trauma that's related to that, and then it all will have to come up, and then you're going to have the process of either healing it or being like, oh, I don't want to deal with that. So essentially they're being like, I don't want to deal with women with trauma is basically a statement that I don't want to deal with my own trauma.
Exactly. Because there's also whoever like you actually attract. And that's why a lot of relationship, I mean, not to sidetrack from the topic of this talk too much, but a lot of relationship advice, it's, most people, we don't consciously choose our partners, right? Yeah. That's a whole fallacy, because there's unconscious drives, especially people who are not engaged in a self-work, where it happens through wound bonding or trauma bonding. So wherever you're in a relationship and your partner has a certain trauma, it kind of correlates to your own stuff as well. There's a shadow dance, so to speak. But going back to the topic, so there seems to be, of the wounded healer, there seems this matrix program of traumatizing people just living in this world where pathology has become normalized. You grow up in this world, completely removed from nature and spirit. It's traumatizing. Yeah. Right? There's a split happening. And that from the matrix perspective, these occult forces, they like to keep us in this trauma state. They like to disintegrate our essence, so to speak, or remove our essence, dislodge our soul, keep our soul fragmented, so they can install their own forces within us. The more we fragment it, like you mentioned before, even severely wounded, even to the point of like high level sociopaths, psychopaths are fully possessed or incarnated Zurich forces, occult forces. Sri Aurobindo talked about that, and others as well. And that's what we see all over the world through various mechanisms, right? And the way we grow up, through media, entertainment, even this whole, the 5G, the transhumanism, food in the poisoning, it's all in some way designed to create cracks and traumatize us on multiple levels, energetically, emotionally, physically, psychologically, on all levels, to keep us from, quote unquote, waking up, ascending, to keep a lot of people, to keep them from fulfilling their work as in terms of service to others, which brings me back to the journey of the wounded healer. There's another thing I want to mention. I've worked with a client a year ago or so, who worked with a pretty well-known like channeler, psychic or something like that. Won't mention the name, but that channeler or psychic she worked with told her that, the client was just sharing that she had dealing with sexual abuse and a lot of trauma, and that psychic told her, well, because of your severe trauma, sexual trauma, you won't have really any chance in this world. You won't be able to wake up, and there's nothing you can do. Wow. Literally, I'm kind of paraphrasing, but that was the message, right? Literally telling that person that because you've experienced so much trauma, especially sexual trauma, you're so influenced by these forces. So this is just the way it is, right? Good luck next time around, so to speak. And that's, whatever was working through that person, that psychic, but shows again like demonizing, victim shaming in a sense, and telling like, oh, you're traumatized, there's something bad with you, there's something wrong with you, there's nothing you can do. Yeah, right?
Well, I mean, I've actually had men who were like interested in me say to me like, oh, maybe you're too fucked up to be in a relationship. That also, correlated with my own self-worth issues as well. But that was like, this is pretty common, I feel, like this attitude.
Yeah. Well, having said that, sometimes in my own life as well, sometimes we need deal with our own stuff for a period of time. Yeah. In a process like you've done, I've a lot of childhood wounding. Like I wasn't ready to be in a relationship at certain points.
Yeah, but anyone I feel who says that to another person is actually just as messed up.
Yes, to say that. Yeah. But it ties in this bigger picture. It's interesting because out of my experience, people who are have suffered a lot and been traumatized, but worked through their stuff in light of the healer, the journey of the wounded healer, become powerful forces for change, for service, for truth, for bringing in the light, for making the darkness conscious as renegades, right? More than people actually that have a very, quote unquote, normal life in a sense. I don't want to
Yeah.
judge people in any shape or form, but in terms of like, if you have it always nice and cozy in your life, comfortable, have never suffered,
Yeah.
right? There's something to be said about soul evolution too, because it ties into the law of descent and ascent.
Yeah, that also ties into like the classic story of like Buddha, and like he grew up in this super comfortable life, but then what he experienced when he went out in the world was he was able to connect deeply with the suffering of the world, and that's actually what allowed him to wake up. It had nothing to do with like his comfortable upbringing. It was actually working against him in a sense, because it was trying to keep him staying in his like quote unquote kingdom that he was going to inherit. He had to experience the suffering.
Yeah.
So let's talk about, this idea like of healing yourself to help others. And I've had actually a few friends who had very great healing powers, but they're like, oh, I need to heal myself more before I help others. So like, how do you feel about that?
When we are ready to, how much do we have to have healed ourselves before we can help others?
Yeah.
Right.
And I can, I'll just share something about that. I'm obviously learning a lot about Buddhism lately. So through the Buddhist lens, there's several stages. There's a Hinayana, which is like the basic Buddhism, that it's about finding the suffering of your own mind, understanding karma, cause and effect, and how it works, and basically healing yourself. So that's the first stage, and that's the classic Buddhism that everyone distorts, basically. And that's the first stage.
Can you just, on that note, I would help our listeners how Buddhism has become distorted? Can you, in a nutshell?
Well, can I do that at the end? Because I'm describing this. Yeah.
Sounds good. Yeah.
But yeah. Okay. And then moving on to the next stage is Mahayana, which is the Bodhisattva, which is being of service to others. And then after that, it's Vajrayana, which is a tantric Buddhism, which is using everything in the world as a means to your own transformation and embracing every aspect of life as a means of your own transformation. In more or less words, I know that I'm not getting that completely right, but anyway, so in order to actually be, like, this is also a natural progression. So unless you're actually able to see through the illusions of your own mind, also see the workings of your own mind, understand how karma works, understand your own death, you cannot be of truly service to others. When you try to jump through one stage or the other, you're working from like a basically like delusional ground. You know what I mean? That happens with this channeler, for instance, or trying to be of service to others through the filter of their own delusions, essentially. So they end up creating more suffering. And I mean, as far as the distortions of Buddhism, Buddhism got taken over by the monasteries. It got turned into this religion. So same thing that happened to Christianity. And then what happens is people oversimplify these ideas and they use them for spiritual bypassing, and in order to like take the teaching on death, for instance, like waking up every morning and realize I might die today. Are many people actually like doing that who take these fake Buddha quotes or whatever? Because in order to really realize that has to change everything. It might make you quit your job. It might make you leave your relationship in order to truly experience that. And instead, people, I feel, use and a lot of these it's interesting. There's like so many fake Buddha quotes. I read more fake Buddha quotes than I read real Buddha quotes. I'm not even joking on the internet. Like, that's how distorted it's become. They're basically using these as distortions, and also they're using it, and this is another thing, to escape the world, when the asceticism was literally a stage in Buddha's life. Like, he went through that whole asceticism, starving himself, meditating in graveyards, and then at the later part of his life, it was all about teaching people to meditate, and he literally did that until his death. So they take it's like cherry picking. It's like they take all sorts of different choosings, whatever is convenient to themselves and whatever they're going through, or whatever is helping them bypass an issue of their life. This is how people distort any spiritual teaching in general. And then anytime, like there's like Krishnamurti says, anytime you institutionalize truth, it becomes distorted. So there's multiple things that went off with it. And then also we have to understand that the spirituality of the world collectively is evolving constantly, even though we're going through a very dark period right now. So the truth that needs to basically come down into this earth is going to be an evolution of what these teachings were. And yeah, it's going to include and build upon these teachings, but it's also going to improve upon them. I think that's the main point. And so you can't take any of these classic teachings as truth, although they are fundamental, they are fundamental for understanding the workings of the mind, for understanding how karma works, for understanding how we create unnecessary suffering. Also, another distortion, that people take of Buddha, where they say that all of life is suffering. That is absolutely not true. It's what the mind creates of the world creates unnecessary suffering. That's the issue. It's the illusions of the mind that create the suffering. Yeah. And yes, there is fundamental suffering to life, as like life, death, this process that we have to go through, getting old. That's the suffering that he's referring to, not the suffering that happens when we create a huge story about a little instance that actually wasn't what truly happened. You know, when we, like, if you say something to me and I make this story about what it means, that's this illusory suffering that we can actually eliminate once we gain more control of our mind.
And like you just mentioned there, how Buddhism or many other religions have been hijacked in this form of aestheticism, of just rejecting the material world, rejecting the body. We see it in Christianity, the body's flesh, and just, you know, in India, the distortion of just going to the Himalayas, meditate, and trying to escape Maya, Lila, the illusion of this world, when instead it is about anchoring the divine here. What Sri Aurobindo talked about, the descent of the supermental, the divine, and embody that and embrace life and do the work we're here to do. As anchors of this divine frequency. And in order to anchor it, going back to the topic, we need to get into our heart, into, like, you know, it's interesting. It's similar in Buddhism, I think, also Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga. The psychic being, the essence, it resides, quote unquote, right behind the heart.
And interestingly, also the Mahayana, which is we'll go into, I think, in the second half of the podcast and meditation, we did the loving kindness meditation that was quite intense for you. But that's all about awakening the heart. So it's all about, you know, getting through the illusions of your own mind, also facing the fundamental aspects of what human life is. And from that point, we can awaken the heart. And also what you're talking about, you know, taking the supermental consciousness into all of reality, meaning that your spiritual life doesn't have to look a certain way. I mean, you could literally, I'm not recommending this, but you could literally work in 7-Eleven as a bodhisattva. Like, it doesn't have to look any way you want it to look like. That's very important.
It's like that what people mistake, this idea of service to others doesn't mean this huge glorious thing you do, like, you know, or, you know, like our work, what you're doing, or I'm doing what I'm doing. I was naturally called to this path of my writings and the work we're doing together now, and you know, personal work. But I never was a career choice or what I had to do. It was just naturally developed itself. But what I do, that's for me personally, that's not what everybody else has to do. Right? We all play our role with our very specific sole purpose. And it has, you know, sometimes I don't know if we talked about it on the podcast before, but sometimes everyday people are even more closer to, like, their essence than people who claim to be spiritual, because, like you mentioned, the ego hijacks the spiritual concept.
Exactly.
Right? And the ego feeds off and wants to have the experience and wants to liberate itself, and it becomes actually a very selfish process.
Exactly. Yeah. And then that's actually very hard to get back from. I think that's the point of it, is because they use these once you start using spiritual techniques to deceive yourself even further, that's also reaching into the, you know, this topic of these spiritual gurus who kind of use these powers to seduce people to their higher levels of spiritual awareness. They use to, you know, like their sexual pathology. It becomes like a vehicle for their sexual pathologies. So yeah, that's another topic on its own, but that's true. That's also, you know, like I feel in a sense, people who are quote unquote, like, you know, working in this traditional healing arts, they get this like almost like glory of a sense. They're the healers of the world, when that's not true. Like I know people, you know, who work in like hospitals, which is total, you know, like quote unquote matrix program, who are doing this work, and it's so hard to have this higher level awareness in that system. You know, there's going to be people waking up in like these in academia. It's going to happen basically everywhere, and we don't know what it's going to look like. And also, we have this picture of like what a healer will look like, especially through this whole, like this new thing, spiritual awakening in social media. Like people are taking photos of them meditating and stuff and going on their spiritual journeys or whatever. And we're creating this like image of what it looks like. I'm not saying this is also not part of the journey that we're going through, But I think the main point is it doesn't have to look any way that it doesn't have to have this image that we expect it to look like. And it's also we're going to wake up exactly where we are. So if we work in business, if we work in, we work as a lawyer, we work as whatever.
Exactly. That's important. That this waking up process is not like all of a sudden the angels harping or you're just leaving the world.
Yeah.
You're exactly where you are, but your perception deepens, it cleanses. You see it more truly through your essence. Your compassion, your heart truly opens. You see, actually connect to the essence of a person.
Yeah.
Right? Not get sidetracked by the shadow projections. You can actually read people better without filtered of your own projected aspects or shadow aspects and whatnot. And there's a more completely embodied compassion, empathy. But, we're almost near the end of the hour. So I want to talk about, of the first hour, I want to talk about what you just mentioned about healer and healing. What does it truly mean to be a healer, right? Because I see it in my own work as a body worker or coach, like we are quote unquote healers. People have called me an amazing healer, blah, blah, and so on and so forth. But I don't personally identify myself as a healer, nor do I claim I don't heal people. It's become very clear, especially when I do body work. I noticed, having done body work now professionally for over 15 years, working on thousands of people, the body, the soma, has its own intelligence. Right? And the spirit infused with it and the life force that is always striving towards health and healing, and it's healing itself. It just needs the right space to be able to heal. And what I see, I help people, be it in my coaching services or in hands-on body work, quote unquote healing work. I'm just a facilitator, holding the space through my own talents and energy. But it's not me doing the healing. It's the client is doing his or her own healing, but just providing the space, giving the opportunity, and maybe breaking some patterns, doing some, providing some energetic adjustments. But the body or the client is healing themselves. You are your own healer. And a true healer, I feel, quote unquote, recognize that they are just a vessel or a channel or just a facilitator, an instrument, rather than the moment you identify yourself, I'm a healer and I heal.
Yeah.
The ego has you and the occult forces have you. And then, we see what happens, what also you mentioned with gurus, just because, or spiritual adepts and people who have these spiritual psychic powers doesn't mean that they're highly evolved. So it's you can actually, that's in any esoteric teachings you read about the warning of not getting tempted by these psychic or spiritual powers that are actually distractions that are on the path.
Exactly. And the spiritual experience, like there's this classic, it's like a Zen story, whenever I think Adyashanti talks about, this guy goes to his teacher and he's like, oh, I had this amazing spiritual experience. He's like, oh, that's great. Keep going. It's like, you just have to move forward. And that's one thing that I did at the beginning as well. Like I was having these amazing spiritual experiences. I was like, wow, like this is so special. Like I'm becoming enlightened or whatever. And now, even though, they're incredible, but I know that you just have to keep going.
Best example, Sri Aurobindo of integral yoga, and he describes in the book Sri Aurobindo or the Adventure of Consciousness by Sadhbram, which is also it's a great introduction, by the way, to Sri Aurobindo's work, and it's infused with his life story. And at some point, Sri Aurobindo, I think 1908, he achieved nirvana and quote unquote enlightenment, and he was in samadhi state for like months, and it was even hard for him to still do his work. He was still even politically involved, but in his own yoga has achieved nirvana. But he realized within the state as well, this was not the end.
Yeah.
Right. And that he just like, this is don't get stuck there. It can be very tempting, this peace and love and bliss. But that nirvana is just an intermediate stage. And he broke through that to this supermind, the overmind, the supermental consciousness. Yeah. And many people get stuck in this idea that nirvana is just like, oh, I'm, in the samadhi state where it's completely formless and peaceful, but you're still like, and there's no individual I and whatnot, but that is, not the end of it all.
Yeah.
And then people just get hooked on that experience. And even the mother said, like what, remember, Sri Aurobindo's partners relates to what you said, whatever you had amazing experience, keep going, keep going, keep going. There's no end to it, right?
Yeah.
We don't stop. It's this kind of evolution keeps going.
Yeah, and just another thing to add to that, a quote that I like, I mean, I've used this with you before, that Reggie Ray says is like, when you think that nothing is happening in your spiritual journey, actually a lot is happening. And when you think that something is happening, it's most likely nothing is happening.
And that kind of, relates to that as well. But it also reminds me of, I really want to go deeper that more called esoteric in the second hour, talking about John of God. Remember that healer from Brazil that recently got exposed or accused of over 500, having sexually abused over 500 women, and he was a star on Oprah. And he has this apparently healing powers, which may be valid, but he even tells himself that he is a conduit, an instrument for up to 20 entities working through him.
Yeah.
That's literally what he said. That's already a red flag in itself.
Yeah.
Right? So he got hooked on this, it's a good example of what I just mentioned in terms of having possibly really psychic gifts and healing powers, but, at having made a pact with the devil, at service of these forces that then were feeding through him through these sexual pathologies.
Yeah, and lots of the channelers are actually channeling these dark forces. And I think that, and just bringing back to the point that you made though, what is a healer? Before any session, I try to, sometimes I forget, but I try and set the intention that I just want to become a channel for God, essentially. And I know that word triggers some people, but that's how I refer to my pure essence, essentially. So whatever the person needs to hear or whatever the person needs from me, I'm just going to be open and receptive to that coming through me. And I think that that's really what a true healer is they're clearing out all of their conditioning, their traumas, their wounds, and the tension in their body so they could become a clearer channel, essentially. It's I think the most wounding part of life is that, especially for children who are way more connected to their essence, the adults that they experience in the world are not mirroring back that essence. So by becoming a clear channel, you can actually start mirroring back to people their true essence, and that helps them remember who they truly are.
Yeah. Let's also address, I think we didn't because we kind of sidetracked a bit about what you meant, and a question you asked before, in terms of wounded healer and the interrelationship between healing your own wounds and then being of service. At one point, do we have to be fully healed before we can help others? Right? I mean, the healer needs to be healed as well, obviously. So there's a fine line sometimes before we actually can, fully help others. We have to have gone through our own process to a certain degree. Certain degree of own healing as well, because I remember also Gurdjieff warned about that. And I remember Sri Aurobindo and the mother as well in their own teachings, the trap of wanting to help people, too early on your path, right? The ego hijacks this concept of service to others, which years ago when even activists out externally focus, want to help others and make the world a better place, but it's coming from their own wounded place, right? And that gets then intermixed. And actually, you can also unconsciously abuse the concept of service to others as a way to distracting from your own process of what you need to do for yourself, just constantly helping others as an avoidance to deal with your own stuff.
Yeah.
So it's very important to recognize that.
Yeah, and I think it comes as a natural progression. And as well, I think, if you do work in a place where you're being of service to others, I think an important aspect is to also recognize your own limitations. I know for myself, I first started doing just tarot and astrology readings for people. And then deeper stuff came up and I didn't know how to help people at that point, and I didn't even try. I think that's the point, is just to recognize your own limitations, being sorry, I actually cannot help you. This is who I would maybe recommend based on my own understanding, but to not try and to not, pretend that also everything and to come from this place of being above someone, I think, and also to recognize I think this is a very unconventional approach to therapy, but to also recognize when you get triggered, because even the people that you're working with will also show you your own blind spots as well. And to not present yourself as being above them or below them, but be okay, we're coming together for a purpose. It can be very healing for both of us, and to not be I'm going to just fix everything for you, because I think really, the best healers that I've worked with, quote unquote, are basically people who empower you, essentially.
Empower you, give the power back to you, right?
Exactly.
And also and help you to find the answers within yourself as well, in a sense, right?
Yeah. So,
that's the end of the first hour.
That's it. Goodbye. I'm just kidding. No. Okay. So I'm just going to mention some of the things that we're going to get into in the second hour of the podcast. And once again, you have to go to the veilofreality.com membership section, sign up to access this. So the things that we didn't get into is the intention behind your work and why that matters when you're being of service to others. What is true compassion? Can you teach compassion? The importance of facing your fears and developing fearlessness and the warrior attitude. What does it mean to truly love yourself? I'm going to talk about these knots they talk about in Vajrayana Buddhism that are around our heart. Basically, we have two channels running through the body that create these knots and on our sacral, our heart. And it's about undoing these hearts in order to allow that energy to flow freely. Your experience with the quote unquote loving kindness meditation, which was quite a tantric approach to loving kindness. This was not what you would expect.
Yes.
Is there such a thing as being too sensitive? Like some kind of conversation about the whole identification with empath culture we have going on, the new age deception of what this heart opening will look like. We're going to go even more detail about these healers who take advantage of people and their own desperation, and the pathological gurus who are calling themselves healers who do more harm than good, and John of God, and there's a bunch of others.
All tying it into, obviously these occult topic of forces and what we mentioned earlier with trauma-based matrix programming. Yeah.
And also, if you are a member of the forum, the community, there's a forum there that's very active. So an essential part of healing is really your sangha, your community. It's completely essential. You cannot do this alone. So the community there is beautiful. It's really flourishing, and it's become a safe container away from Facebook, which is completely infected with AI and people telling you what you should and shouldn't think. That it's not actually a safe place to share experiences. So that's become a great place. Yeah. And then also each month in the middle of the month, we're doing a monthly live Zoom call for members as well. So if you want to kind of connect deeper, this is an opportunity for you to do so. And once again, we also on the forum, we have a discussion post for you to talk about any insights that came up regarding this topic. So
exactly. All right. See you guys in the second hour.